Hello, and welcome back to the Seeing Better podcast. I am fresh back from a trip to Europe. I went to Europe for about a week, and I went to London first, and then in the middle went to Iceland, and then came back to London, and then flew back to LA just a few days ago. So I am pretty jet lagged, but the good part of coming back to California is that I actually was able to make up some time. So I went to bed at 8 o'clock last night and then woke up at 3 a.m., which not exactly optimal, but in terms of adjustment, I'm at least glad that I was able to sleep a good 7 hours. And I know tomorrow night I'm going to be probably just fine. So here's hoping. I'm going to try to do all the things that I can to get me back on track, but so far so good. So I have time this morning to record a podcast, and I thought what better to do would be a Iceland recap of my trip there. So I will go through all the nuts and bolts and share with you what I did, what I recommend, and things to do for the future if you're thinking of going to Iceland yourself. So let's start with the concept. So my friends and I had decided that we wanted to go see the Northern Lights. And obviously that's a big dream of many people. And we wanted to do it in a way that was somewhat affordable and hopefully would give us the best chance of actually seeing the Northern Lights. So we went through a few options and looked at a couple of different scenarios. And the Northern Lights can be seen in the upper half of the Northern Hemisphere. So think Iceland, Norway, Greenland, and Finland. And then even in like the southern hemisphere area, maybe in Antarctica or something like that. So we knew that we wanted to go somewhere in Europe and decided on Iceland because it's become very tourist friendly over the past couple of years, and I'll go through why. But that seemed to be the best for everyone in mind. So we booked a trip and we booked through Iceland Air. And Iceland Air has done a really great job at promoting tourism to Iceland, and I can definitely understand why. So they have an interesting policy where you're able to extend your stay in Iceland even past just a couple of hours in a stopover. You can extend it up to 7 days without extra charge if you book through them. So very great opportunity if you're thinking of going somewhere and you want to do an extended trip to Iceland. I highly, highly recommend. So we decided to book through Iceland Air. And since I was going to London to visit my friends, we flew out from London, which ended up being pretty easy. It was about a 2.5, 3 hour flight from London. So super simple, really nothing crazy. In order to go to Iceland, I likely would have had to do a stopover anyways. So it just worked out to go from there. So we went from Monday night to Thursday afternoon, and we got in very, very late on Monday night, around midnight or so. It was really, really late. So we were all very exhausted and just ready to get to bed. We landed in Iceland. We picked up the car, and it was very cold when we picked up the car. And I was surprised that there wasn't a better system of having covered car park or something like that because it gets so insanely cold there. But no, it was in the open air. So the guy just said, okay, your car's going to be over there. Go ahead and pick it up. We got there. I believe it was -3 degrees Celsius. So very, very cold. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was actually the wind chill that was far worse than the actual temperature. If it was just -3, it honestly would have been just fine, but it was the wind that was the true factor here. So we went the first week of April, and that was intentional because according to, I don't know, people on TikTok, apparently, this would be the best chance to see the Northern Lights in April in Iceland. So there was a bunch of content made on seeing the Northern Lights and how clear it should be in April to see them. So we thought, okay, great, we'll have a good chance of seeing them and go with that. So we picked up our car. It was so cold. It was extremely windy, and I didn't totally have my bearings about myself yet because we had just come from London. So I wasn't fully covered in all the things that you need to withstand the cold there. So we got in the car, we warmed up, and we hit the road from the airport, which was in, I believe it's Keflavik. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it that way, but the main airport there. And we hit the road. So we knew we had about an hour drive from the airport to our Airbnb in Reykjavik, which is the main city in Iceland, the biggest one, I believe, and the one that I'm sure most of you know about. So we hit the road and we decided, okay, we're going to chill, and then tomorrow we'll hit the ground running. And I ended up driving, and so we're just driving along, and near the airport is a volcano which has been erupting, and that was an unexpected surprise that we had. So we didn't know that it was actually going to be erupting when we had booked the trip, but I had seen on the news a couple weeks prior that it was erupting. And to my knowledge, this isn't that crazy for people in Iceland to experience. It's something that they know is going to happen periodically every 50, 60, 100 years, whatever the case may be. So we were driving along, and not too far from the airport, we saw this volcano that was erupting, and it was unbelievably magical. I have never seen a volcano that was erupting in front of my own eyes, but we could see it from the freeway. It was relatively clear, and it wasn't fully fleshed out, but we could see the lava and the eruption happening. So that was such a great way to start off the trip, and I'm so glad we did end up seeing that, because I'll explain a little bit later why that was. But that was an exhilaration to start off the trip from the very jump. So we saw the lava erupting from the freeway, and that was amazing. And I now understand a little bit better why people are able to do a stopover and really get a good understanding of Icelandic culture, even just a couple miles away or kilometers away from the airport. And that is that this volcano, said volcano that was erupting, is very close to the airport, or relatively at least. You could probably take an Uber there if you wanted to, or whatever their equivalent is to that, and see the volcano. In this case, it was actually erupting, which was just a cherry on top. And then the Blue Lagoon, which is the big lagoon hot spring that I'm sure you've seen all over social media. That's this really ice blue with heat coming out of it, and people do mud masks and they have a spa day. That ended up being closed because of the volcanic eruption. And while I was quite disappointed, because that was the one thing that I really, really wanted to do, I think the fact that there was a volcanic eruption was the best reason that it could have been to be canceled. So I was disappointed, but at the same time, I was like, you know what? I think we're going to be in a hot spring later anyway, so we'll just figure out a plan B. And off we went. So we made it our way to the Airbnb, and we had rented an Airbnb in the heart of Reykjavik, and we didn't see a ton of the first night, of course, because it was dark, but there is a very beautiful church there. It's so high, and it has this interesting architecture about it. It's an extremely tall building, but then it has these layers on the side, kind of like a triangle. You just have to look it up. It's really, really special. And that seems to be the center of the city, and our apartment was very close to that. It was just stone's throw away from there. And we had rented a 3-bedroom Airbnb, which ended up being perfect for 5 people. It had 1 bathroom, so I would say, for a longer term stay, it would have been great to have an extra bathroom. But other than that, the Airbnb was phenomenal. It had views of the mountains, and it had a great kitchen, and it just felt very clean and nice and special and cozy. So A+ there for the Airbnb choice that we ended up with. We had originally intended to stay closer to the airport because there was an Airbnb listing that had a chance, I believe, of seeing the Northern Lights. I'm not sure in hindsight if that would have actually been the case, but they also had a hot tub. So that's what we had originally booked. And long story short, the Airbnb owner had to shift some things. So we ended up staying actually in Reykjavik, which in hindsight, I think was a better choice, because near the airport, there isn't a lot to do. There's not a lot of things to see. And it would also be farther away from some of the excursions that we were doing. So all in all, I think it was for the better that we had ended up staying in Reykjavik, because we also got to see a little bit of that city and were closer in proximity to restaurants and food and things like that. So Airbnb was great, very, very clean. Had a washer and dryer, which for me is just an A plus, and also a dishwasher, which I can't really ask for much more. Had a car park as well, so I parked the car, and we had a Toyota RAV4, which was a great choice for Iceland because the conditions change quite a lot. I think that's one thing that I will absolutely impart on anyone going to Iceland, and that is that the weather can change at the drop of a hat, and you may go through 10 different types of terrain in one day. So the RAV4 was a great choice to be able to drive through all the conditions that we were under during this trip. And in early April, it can kind of run the gamut. So it was definitely very cold. So I will say, do not underestimate the weather that is in Iceland. That's rule number one. You do not want to be underprepared. It is likely going to be colder than you think. Apparently, in the summer, it gets up to only about, I think it's 12 degrees Celsius. I could be totally wrong. I'm sorry. But in the 50s, essentially. So it's not that hot. So you definitely have to pack layers. You have to pack more than you think you might actually need, because when we were there, it was about 3 degrees Celsius during the day and it was extremely windy. So we had packed our big parkas, and I had packed that onto the plane and wore it on the plane because that was the only way that I was going to be able to do it, since I wasn't checking bags and I was going from LA to London to then Reykjavik back to London and then back to LA. So I had to be nimble in what I was bringing. So I brought my parka on the plane, which was perfect. And then I packed a bunch of Lululemon outfits as a base layer. So I would wear two pairs of leggings on the bottom, and then like two pairs of long sleeves on top, a sweater on top of that, a parka, a beanie, two layers of socks, and a good pair of shoes. So just expect like you're going to the Arctic, because that's essentially what it is. So that would be my number one recommendation, which is to bring more layers than you think you need, because it could absolutely change in a matter of minutes. So we had all of our stuff. We had arrived in Reykjavik, and then our first day, since we were in the heart of Reykjavik, we're able to go to a very nice bakery, and I've learned that is one of the biggest treasures in Iceland, and that is that they love their pastries. So if you love pastries, Reykjavik and Iceland in general is a great place for that. It was phenomenal, and I am gluten and dairy free, so I only had a couple of bites just to taste what it tasted like, but my friend said it was absolutely phenomenal. So we ended up going to this little coffee shop that had a patisserie that was just down the block as well. It was called Reykjavik Roasters. And we all agreed that whatever we had from there was delicious, like just very well made, great quality, super cozy. I'm always fascinated with Scandinavian culture just because I think that there's a way of slow living that I love that they integrate into day to day. And this isn't Icelandic in nature, but there's a Swedish tradition, obviously, of hygge, which I'm sure many people know about, Hyggge. And that is just the act of slowing down and soaking up coziness in our day to day activities. But they also have another tradition that my friend Cecilia taught me about. She's from Sweden. And it is called a fika. So a fika, Fika, is essentially a respite that you have in the afternoon, and it could be with your friends or at work or wherever. It's basically like a siesta time, and you go get a coffee and a little treat, and you maybe sit at a cafe and just take some time off in the afternoon, which I love because I always hit that 3 p.m. slump, and I feel like if I did that, I would just be better off. So that's something that I'm potentially looking to bring into my everyday routine. But we started off at Reykjavik Roasters, which would have been great for a fika, but we did end up going in the morning. I had a chai latte, and it was phenomenal. Sometimes chais are too sweet or too bitter, and it was just perfect. So I loved that. And they also had a chia seed pudding, which, in all honesty, chia seed pudding isn't my absolute favorite dish of all time, but it was the gluten and dairy free option, and I wanted to get some food in me at that point, so it was going to work. And it actually ended up being phenomenal. It was so good. It was so fresh. It had some different nuts and seeds and fruit, and it was just the perfect consistency and so fresh. So highly recommend Reykjavik Roasters. And there's also a little bakery around the corner as well, which was phenomenal. I didn't have anything from there, but my friend said it was great. So we were all suited up, ready to go, and we jetted off on our first adventure in Iceland, which was going to the Golden Circle. And the Golden Circle is essentially a circular route that you can take that will allow you to do different stop offs. So essentially, it's like you're going into a national park, and you can go and see different waterfalls and different attractions and such. So we started on our route to the Golden Circle, which I want to say round trip was several hours. We ended up going maybe at 10 a.m. in the morning, I want to say, and came back around 5. So it was a full day. And you could make it as long or as short as you want. But I believe if you were going to go there and back, it would at least be about 2.5 hours from Reykjavik, if not more. So tip number 2 I have for Icelandic adventures is definitely rent a car if you're not going to go with a guided tour group, and also expect that you're going to be driving a lot. Luckily, the driving there seemed to be very safe, bar any snow that's on the forecast. But in terms of the other drivers, I felt very safe. So there was no issues there. So we went to the Golden Circle, and I would recommend that you map this out before you go, because there are so many different stop offs that you can take. So you really got to decide what you want to do and where you want to go. And then you can always pivot from there. But we decided to do the Golden Circle on our own. You can do it in a tour group, I'm sure, but we just decided to do our own thing. So we first stopped off at a place that we thought we would want to go to, but it ended up not being the hike that we had expected. But anyways, we filled up for gas and we got some snacks and we went to the restroom. So all in all, it was just fine. But we definitely took a lot of breaks throughout the day. And then we drove a little bit further and we went to our first foss or waterfall. If it's called a foss in Iceland, that's essentially a waterfall. And they have so many of them. And if you've ever seen a picture of Iceland, you've probably seen the waterfalls that are absolutely incredible. So we wanted to see many a foss while we were there, and we absolutely did. But I'm sure we did not even see half of them. There are so many, I'm not even sure. It's probably in the hundreds, honestly, in Iceland, because they are absolutely everywhere. But we went to our first foss, which was, I believe it's called Brurfoss, something along those lines. I cannot speak Icelandic for shit, so forgive me if that's incorrect, but it was absolutely stunning. It was just a short little hike down from the parking area to a little wooden bridge, and it was basically a larger stream. So it wasn't a total waterfall like you've seen in movies and stuff. It was more of like a stream or a river, but it did have a little bit of a waterfall feature, and it was a little icy, but not too icy. And the water there was so incredibly blue. I can't even explain. It was stunning. It was like as blue as the eyes are of the Icelandic people. Like it was just crystal clear, unbelievable. And I'm not even sure why it ends up being this blue, but it was just something like I've never seen before. And we all were blown away by this. It was definitely very cold while we were there the entire time, but it was so worth it because it just blew everyone away. I had just seen Dune 2 the week prior, and it was similar to that blue water stuff that's in that movie. It was like that kind of blue. It was so blue. So we took lots of pictures around that area, and we're just super jazzed by the fact that that was our first stop, and it was absolutely incredible. We went a little bit farther on our Golden Circle tour, and we ended up going to one of the geysers. So the geysers are the natural hot springs that spurred up kind of like a Shamu situation. And we went to the geyser and we stopped off at the location where they had a hotel and they had a restaurant and all kinds of extra things. And that made for a perfect stop for us. So we could see the geyser and then we could also have a lunch break as well. Tip number 3, know that Iceland is going to be very expensive. I believe it must be from all the importing that they do, but the car and the Airbnb, I believe, were not so pricey, but the food definitely was. So definitely know that you're going to be spending a lot on food, but I will say that the food exceeded my expectations quite a bit. It was very, very good across the board. So I would recommend just putting an extra little chunk of money in your food budget because the food is expensive, but it will be worth it, trust me. So we stopped over at the geyser, and apparently the geyser water can go up to like 80 or 100 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit, excuse me. I'm getting on my metrics backwards, but up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you weren't able to actually touch the water because it would have been too hot. It might even be Celsius, honestly. I'll have to fact check that later. But you weren't able to touch the water, but you could see the geyser. And that was incredible too, because I don't think I've ever seen a geyser before. My friends decided to go up one of the little hikes and see it from another angle. So a lot of these attractions ended up having a place where it was lower down so you could just kind of see it from the ground wherever you're parking. And then they also had an option to hike. So definitely bring a pair of shoes with traction. In hindsight, I would have liked to bring my hiking boots, although, like I said, I only had a carry-on and was doing a ton of miles in that week. So I had to be very judicious about what I was bringing. But in hindsight, I would have totally benefited from bringing a pair of hiking boots because there were so many on-foot excursions that we were doing. So if you have a pair, definitely bring that. Also, in terms of what to dress up for, it's all about wearing your recreational gear. So it's not necessarily about being super fancy or cute or fashionable. It's really just about function. So whatever you have in terms of hiking gear, I would recommend that you bring. So we saw the geyser, and at this point, it was very cold. The wind was pretty biting. So I ended up coming back and getting a bite to eat in the stop off place. And I used the restroom and just had a little bit of chill time because at this point I was still quite jet lagged. So I was trying to preserve my energy because we were going, and seeing so much in the day that I wanted to just have a little bit of time to myself. So we rested up and we got some food at this place, and then we went on our way. And then we went to a huge waterfall, like huge. Like I honestly can't even describe how huge it was. It was just ginormous. I can't remember the name of this one, but I'm sure it's probably the most famous, I have to imagine, or one of the most famous in the country. It was like the size of, I don't know, it was huge. Like I don't even know if I can put it into words, but it was absolutely stunning and it was ginormous. It was like maybe larger than a cruise ship. Yeah, it was larger than a cruise ship, but it was huge. And it was flowing, but it was also very, very icy. So a lot of it was frozen over, which was even cooler. But at this point, it got even windier and it was so cold. So we didn't spend a ton of time there. But again, I went in the car and I rested up a little bit and warmed my feet. So friendly reminder if you are going in anywhere in the winter, and honestly I wouldn't necessarily recommend that because it was already so cold in the beginning of April, but if you are, definitely bundle up, definitely bring all the layers, definitely wear a beanie and all the things. I would have liked actually those things that warm up in your hand. I think that would have been even more helpful too. So do not underestimate the Iceland weather. It is cold there. Some people are like, oh, like isn't Iceland where all the green is, and Greenland is where all the Iceland ice is? And while that may be true, Iceland is still really cold. So take care of yourself. And then we ended up after the glacier. What did we end up doing? I believe we saw a couple more waterfalls and we did the full circle tour. And at the end of the day, we were absolutely exhausted. It was so much fun, but being out in the elements and hiking, and for me being jet lagged, it was quite a day. So we were exhausted, but we were able to see a ton. So I highly recommend renting a car. I'm sure a guided tour would be fun too, but I did like having the opportunity to just see what we wanted to see and let go of what we maybe didn't, we just wanted to drive past. I forgot one more thing that we did, and we went to the I believe it's called the Carrid Crater. And that was towards the end of our full circle tour. So we stopped off at the Carrid Crater, which is a crater. And I don't think I've ever seen a crater before, but it was the size of an arena. Like it was a full blown arena, probably the size of the Coliseum, to be honest. And it was huge. I just thought it was going to be like a little hole in the ground, but it was huge. So we did another hike on top of the crater. So we did the perimeter, which was probably about 15 minutes. It wasn't too bad, but we did the perimeter of the top of the crater. And then my friends decided to go down and actually go to the bottom where there was a lake frozen over. So it was, imagine this really giant crater, and then in the middle there was a iced over lake basically, and it had also that stunning blue water that you could see from a mile away. So that was also very, very beautiful. At this point, we were very tired, so this was pretty much the end of the Golden Circle tour, but we decided to head back to Reykjavik, and I want to say it's at least about 2 hours back. So again, a lot of driving, so definitely know you're probably going to at least do about 5 hours of driving a day, and it will be worth it, but you will be doing a lot of driving. So we came back, and we were very, very tired, but this night we had planned the Northern Lights tour, and we were intending to do a boat tour to see them. So at this point, we still thought we were doing that. And on our way back, the tour guide had called us and said that the visibility wasn't good enough and we likely wouldn't be able to see the Northern Lights that day. So they pushed it back another day. And we were disappointed at first, but to be honest, I was so exhausted that I was okay with waiting another day to see it. So we get back to Reykjavik and we're all cozy, but we were also very, very hungry. So we went downstairs by our Airbnb to a restaurant called Kol, Kol, and it was absolutely incredible food. It was amazing. It was a very cozy, modern vibe, and they had a ton of choices. So they had some more traditional Icelandic food and then also some pasta and risotto and other like a fusion type restaurant. So tons of choice for everyone that was there. And we had sat down and they had the most amazing drinks. Like my friends had these ice drinks that basically was, I believe, like a gin and tonic, but it had this light in it that made it look like that same blue color that we saw in the water. And everyone just loved everything that they ordered. Important to note here about the food in Iceland is that they eat a lot of food and meat that we don't in America. So we were excited about that, but we were also nervous because that could mean a lot of things. And we had to draw a line somewhere because we weren't going to go full puffin, like they eat puffin there, which just sounds really, really sad. Because I've never seen a puffin before, but they're so cute. So I wasn't super into trying that necessarily. But we did end up eating reindeer at this restaurant, and I've never had reindeer before. And we were all on board with it, so we decided to order a appetizer of reindeer tartare and a miso reindeer dish as well to share. And it was unreal. Like, it was so amazing. It was like a very like a more raw version of a filet mignon, but so tender and so juicy, so incredible. But also I dedicate it also to this restaurant because they had pulled out all the stops. Their flavor profiles were amazing. I highly recommend this place. Do know that it's very expensive, so just know that, but it will be well worth it. So we had the reindeer, and then for dinner I had a fish that was fresh caught, I believe, from the lake nearby, and it tasted very, very good, not very fishy at all. And I was also very surprised at how allergen friendly they were in Iceland, in the UK as well, but also in Iceland. I would have expected that it just would not have really been an option. But we did have a few allergies in our group and they were nothing but accommodating. So I give a big kudos to everyone in Iceland for doing that. It must maybe be a policy or something. They had a good amount of gluten-free options and a good amount of vegan options as well. Iceland is very sustainable, so I imagine that there might be some people there that are vegan for that reason. So we went to Cole and we had a fabulous dinner. We were a little bit caught off guard by how expensive it was, but it's always funny when you go to a really nice meal. As long as it's super good, it doesn't feel like you're spending that much money. But we decided after that we were going to probably be a little bit more low key after that. So we went back to the Airbnb and just hung out, and we're trying to get cozy and warm. And it did snow a little bit while we were there, but it was nothing crazy. It wasn't a full snowstorm. It was just kind of cute snow that was coming down very softly. So great time for us. If it would have been worse in terms of the snow, I would have probably been more apprehensive about driving. But luckily, it was not crazy while we were there. The second day, we got up and we were ready to go. So the second day, we went to the southern part of Iceland to a town called Vik. So Vik was about 2.5 hours away from Reykjavik, and we had an excursion plan, so we had to go and leave very early. So we left at 7 a.m. and we got some food and drinks before we left, and we're on our way. So we drove down to Vik, and it was amazing at how many different types of scenery that we saw within the 2 days. Like the first day and the second day were completely different because they were different parts of the island, but just the most amazing landscapes that you've ever seen in your life. The first day was a bit more like a national park vibe, but then the second day was a little bit more like middle America, like the plains of like Montana or Wyoming or something like that. So it felt very exotic and different and just very, very magical. The whole time when we were driving, we were constantly stopping to say, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. I've never seen anything like this. And I will say Iceland has just exceeded my expectations in so many ways. They also had a ton of wildlife throughout the entire visit, but also even just on the side of the road. They had so many horses, cows, goats, you name it, they had it, all of the wildlife as well. So that was really cool to see from the car too. So we made it down to Vik, and this was where we were going to go on our next excursion, which was the ice cave tour. And the ice cave tour was my favorite part of the trip because it was something that I never expected I would probably ever do, and just didn't feel like real life. Like it felt like a dream or something, or like being on National Geographic. So we went down to the stopover place in Vik, and we got on the, I believe it was Arctic Adventures bus. And it wasn't a bus, but it was more of a van that had these huge tires on them. In Iceland, they have these recreational vehicles that look unlike anything I've ever seen anywhere else. They just have these ginormous tires on like a Land Cruiser or a van or some kind of car like that, or a yeah, like anything along those lines. And that I believe is made so then you can drive through snow or different terrain and such. So we got in one of those big vans and we went on our way, and we drove about 45 minutes over to the glacier. So we went over to the glacier, and it was a fun ride on our way over there because it felt like Indiana Jones. It was like this crazy bumpy ride, and we were already having a ton of fun, and it felt like we were on another planet. Truly, it felt like I was going through Mars or Jupiter and like landing on the moon. It was crazy. You really just can't explain it because you have to go there. It's unbelievable. And I had just seen Dune 2 the week prior, like I said, and so many things were making me think of that because it just felt like somewhere other than Earth. And we drove over and we saw more dormant volcanoes and mountains and just the most amazing views you've ever seen in your life. And we got to the glacier. We got out of the car and hiked a little bit over in the snow. And I was only wearing my Hokas at this point because I had another pair of boots, but they didn't have great traction on them. And I was worried about the Hokas because they, while they're great for, light recreation, they really aren't made for this kind of adventuring. But luckily, we just had a short little walk over to our rest area. And then we put on these things called crampons or crampons, whatever they're called. But they basically are little covers for your shoes where then they have spikes on them so you can walk up snow in the mountain. So we put on those crampons or crampons, and we loved them. We were like, this is the best invention ever because it made any shoe possible to climb the mountain. So we were with our tour group and we put on the crampons, we put on the helmet because there could be falling ice, but luckily at this point it was a little bit warmer, so there wasn't as much of a risk of that, but we did put the helmets on. And we went up this mountain, and it wasn't too far. It was probably 10 minutes, and liked hiking. We went up the mountain, and then we went on our ice tour. So it was an ice cave tour, and it was on a glacier, which is really insane to even say out loud. We went on the ice cave tour, and we had this lovely tour guide named Tor on the tour, and he was so funny, so Icelandic, and just kind of like a funny older guy. But he was telling us about the volcano and how the eruptions work and what happens, and this area is actually overdue for a volcanic eruption and potentially even some loss of landmass. So we were very excited to hear about that. So basically the town of Rick could be in the ocean at some point. The last volcanic eruption, it sounded like, was in 1916 or something like that, over 100 years ago, which is overdue for something like that. So very interesting to hear about that. There wasn't a ton of homes or houses over there, but it was more commercial. So they had a stop area, rest area for like food, and a store and a pizza place and a gas station, but it wasn't like people were necessarily living over there a bunch, although I'm sure some do. And it was just a very interesting place. So we went on this ice cave tour, and basically we walked around the glacier, and it had a giant hole in it, so you could see like far out from the glacier and even over towards the mountains with the view, which was amazing. We like touched the side of the glacier. Tour took a piece of the glacier off for each one of us to eat and drink from the source, and it's like the most pure water that you can drink. So we had a little bit of an ice chip as a snack, and that was very cool. Iceland has some of the purest drinking water in all of the world, so you can drink out of the tap, you can basically drink anywhere, and it is fresh. So that's an amazing perk as well. This is where we went into the cave. So we went into the cave, and I can explain it as looking like the Matterhorn at Disneyland, basically. So you're in this cave, which is exactly what it sounds like. And there was even a little waterfall in there that we saw. So we took a picture of the waterfall inside of the ice cave and touched the side of the walls, which were somewhat cold, but mostly just kind of slimy feeling. And that was just such a trip. And we took a bunch of pictures while we were there, and had such a great day. That day was actually sunny, which was great. It was still very cold, so it wasn't like it was warm by any means, but it was not as windy, so that helped us a ton. If it were windy and cold that day, it would have been brutal, I'm not going to lie, because the total excursion ended up being about 3 hours. So we did all our stuff on the glacier. We walked back, and we had another crazy ride back over to the stopover area. So all in all, the ice glacier tour, I highly recommend. The name of the volcano is the Katla volcano in Vik. So highly recommend that you check that out. I mean, that would probably be my number one recommendation of all the things that we did. I believe the company we did it through was Arctic Adventures as well. So 10 out of 10 experience. It was unreal, and something I never thought that I would have done, but it felt like truly another world. So we came back to Vik, and Vik also has a black sand beach because of the volcano. And basically when the volcano erupts, the lava turns into this black sand, and then you have your black sand beach. And it was still cold, but at least like a little bit warm enough for us to kind of explore on the black sand beach and walk around and touch the water, which was of course very cold, but it was very cool to see that as well, because I didn't really expect to see the beach there. But apparently people do surf there occasionally. I'm sure more so in the summer because it's still super cold, but it's cool to know that some people do that. So this is a little bit of a surfing area, but I think the actual surf town that most people frequent when they are surfing in Iceland was closed because of the volcano. So didn't end up going there. We ended up making our way back to Reykjavik after this because we were, for one, very exhausted, and we're going to go on the Northern Lights tour that night as well. But on our way back, we were able to see several waterfalls, and we even saw one with a rainbow, which was so magical and so awesome. But you have plenty of opportunities to see more waterfalls even after you go back to Reykjavik from Vik. So highly recommend that you budget some time for that too. But such amazing landscapes. We were listening to some folksy music, and it was just such a vibe. So awesome. So we came back and we had some dinner at our Airbnb in Reykjavik, and we're going to kind of just chill while we waited for the tour to start at 10 p.m. And I was so exhausted. So I was really wanting to just rest before we did that because I was low on sleep and low on energy. But on our way back, we unfortunately got a call from the Northern Lights tour people from the boat tour that we had originally booked that had moved our appointment to Wednesday night, that they had said that Wednesday night actually ended up not being clear enough as well. So they had to cancel our booking. And we were very disappointed because obviously going to Iceland was predicated on the fact that we wanted to see the Northern Lights. So we quickly came up with a plan B, and we found a tour group that was highly recommended on Viator and decided to book that one. And that one was a little bit more expensive, but we thought this would be our best shot at seeing it because we were going to leave the next day. So we booked the tour, and we went back to Reykjavik, had dinner, took a shower, rested up, all the things, and then we went back out at 10 p.m. and went on this tour. So we walked over about 10 minutes through Reykjavik, which was cool to just kind of see the city. And we waited for the bus to arrive. So this bus was like a small tour bus, and we had a great tour guide as well for this one. He was very funny, and he told us a little bit about the history of Iceland and Icelandic culture, which was interesting. And then there was also some videos on the Northern Lights, and I can by no means explain how you can see that, but I highly recommend that you look it up because it is very interesting. But there's this whole phenomena on how you can actually see it and why. And so we learned about that, and we went on our way. So to see the Northern Lights is not necessarily a perfect science. So he had addressed the question that was on everyone's mind, which was, are we going to see the Northern Lights today? And he had this awesome phrase, and that was, if you don't fish, you will never catch anything, basically. And it was very true for this excursion because we weren't going to see the Northern Lights if we didn't at least try. And in Reykjavik, I don't believe you can see them very often, if at all, because of the air pollution and such. So you have to go outside of that area. And I'm not sure where the best place to see the Northern Lights in the country is, but in hindsight, I would recommend that you research that and potentially even stay in that area if that's something that you really, really want to do. So we went on our way, and we just started basically driving out. And this guy has done the Northern Lights tours for, I'm sure, many, many years. And so he said, we're going to do our best, but you never know. Like it's a total gamble. And that's one thing that you definitely need to know about Iceland, is that there's no guarantee that you're going to see the Northern Lights, and neither in any other places where you can see the Northern Lights, but you can certainly try. So we basically just started driving out. And at this point, I was absolutely exhausted, and I slept the whole way because it was completely pitch black. So there wasn't really anything for me to see from the car anyway. So I just decided to sleep. And it was also very, very cold. So we ended up just going on our way. We drove at least about an hour. I don't know because I was asleep, but at least about an hour outside of Reykjavik. And we stopped over at this place. And I think how they do this tour is basically they go to the nearest place outside of the city that they know of, and then they kind of like go from there. So we went to this first stop place, and you just look up in the sky and see if there's any stars. And I don't know exactly what the logic is here, but basically if you can see a star, then he was going to take us to where we could see more stars, apparently. I don't know. And we were standing outside for probably a good half an hour, and we couldn't see anything. It just was, there was no stars. And so we got in the car and we drove another, I don't know, maybe an hour or so, and went to a very remote location with just some bathrooms. And it was in the middle of nowhere. There was no lights whatsoever except for a little bit of greenhouse gas emissions. But other than that, like, you couldn't see a thing. And it was pitch black, which I imagine would be good for seeing the northern lights because there isn't that air pollution like in the city. So we went out to this very, very remote location and we looked up in the sky and someone ended up seeing a star. And so we saw a star within probably the first 15 or so minutes while we were there. And you kind of have to wait and see if the northern lights are going to appear once you see the star. And so we saw a star, and then we ended up seeing so many stars after that. It kind of cleared up. So we saw so many stars, and we were so hopeful that we were going to see the northern lights, but nothing. And we were outside at that location for at least a good hour. And at this point, it was the middle of the night, and it was very, very cold. My toes were starting to feel like they were going to fall off. But the good news is that they had hot chocolate and cinnamon buns on the bus so we could have that to enjoy as a snack in the middle of the night while we were trying to see the northern lights. And that was my favorite part, to be honest, because that was just so exciting. And I was like, you know what, it's going to be so worth it. I'm going to have the gluten and dairy that's part of this meal, but I'm so excited and so cold that I will do anything. And it was so good. It was so, so good. We had a hot chocolate. It was just perfect, and a really, really yummy cinnamon bun. So we did not see the northern lights at that point, but we were now full in our bellies with the snack, so we were happy about that. And so we went in the car again and probably drove for another, I don't know, hour and went to another location. And unfortunately, at this point, we did not see them, and we did our very, very best, but we had to drive back, and it was now very late in the day. So we ended up getting back to Reykjavik at like 2:30 a.m. So very, very late night. You definitely have to plan accordingly for this because you may not see them, to be quite honest. It's, there's a chance you can, and there's a chance you may not actually see it. And then also, it just is in the middle of the night, so it's very exhausting. So what I would recommend that if you're going to go to Iceland to see the northern lights, you do it starting the first night that you get there if possible, or the earliest night that you can. So then any night after that, you can go on the tour again. So basically how this worked is that we paid, but there is a 3-year warranty essentially, so you can go on the tour again as many times as you want between now and then to see them. So you can actually go back and do the tour again. So for instance, if you did the tour on a Tuesday, you could do it, for as many nights as you're there to hopefully see them. So we did not have that chance. It was our one and only night that we could do it, but we tried, and I was happy that we at least tried to do it, and that there's a chance that I can see them in the future, and I know I'll see them in the future. So I wasn't too bummed. I was also just, like I said, very, very tired. So I was ready to go to sleep and just get some good rest because I was incredibly jet lagged. So we got back at around 2:30, went to sleep at 3 a.m., walked through Reykjavik, and were just unbelievably tired. And we slept, and then the next day we were supposed to leave. So this was Thursday at this point, and we got some coffee in the morning at, I want to say it was called Sandcroft in Reykjavik. It was another bakery, and it was just as good, if not better, as the other place. I had a little taste of my friend's pastries, and they were unreal. They had a bunch of fresh coffee and just so many great things. I mean, the food there was really, really, really great. So I think that's one of the key pieces that I would enjoy while you're there, because they have so many great things. Another dish that they have there is fermented shark. I did not try that, but they do have that, and it's one of their specialties. So we had our little nice brunch over at the bakery, and this day we didn't have a ton of time because we were going to leave at 4 p.m. from the airport, but we decided that we wanted to try and go to an alternate location for the lagoon experience, which was called Sky Lagoon in Reykjavik. So this one was actually much closer to where we were staying. It was only about 10-15 minutes away in the city. So a little bit of a different vibe, but it was gorgeous from the outside. So I definitely wanted to try to go if we could, and it was completely booked because the Blue Lagoon was closed. So it was very much impacted at this point. And unfortunately, because we didn't book a reservation prior and there were no last minute cancellations because it was so busy, we didn't end up going. But I highly, highly, highly recommend that you book either the Blue Lagoon or Sky Lagoon, or there's also a couple of other options outside of Reykjavik before you go, and plan accordingly because they are very busy. And in this case, since Blue Lagoon was closed, the only other option for us was Sky Lagoon before we left. But I was really impressed by the facilities. It looked unreal. So I would recommend that you check that out when you're in Reykjavik. So since we didn't end up going in any of the lagoons, we thought, okay, we'll just go back towards the airport area, pack our bags, and see if we can see the volcano another time. And we drove back, and this was about an hour drive over to the airport area. And before we went to the airport, we went to a lake that was supposedly able to see the volcano. And this day was the snowiest day that we had. It wasn't snowing in a way where it was unsafe by any means, but it was very cold and very overcast and snowy. So we drove over to this lake, and it was like, this truly felt like Mars. It was another land. There was no notions of civilization. It was completely in the middle of nowhere, and it was so fogged over that it was really creepy, actually. But it was really cool. So we thought we'd go over to the lake. And unfortunately, it was so overcast that we could not see a thing. We couldn't see the volcano, but it was at least cool to see this other part of the island. And we drove back. And then our last stop was to a lighthouse near the airport because we could see the ocean and just get one last view of a different area before we left. And so we saw the lighthouse, and it was very cold, but it was really cool to see the ocean from that view. And then the best part about the trip was that we saw a whale while we were there. And that was so unexpected. When we were walking down the little slope to the lighthouse, I thought, I wonder if you can see whales here. And we ended up seeing one, which was so, so cool. That was very special and a very magical way to end off the trip. And at that point, we had to make our way over to the airport and jet back over to London. But that concludes my Iceland recap and my trip recommendations. All in all, Iceland was a 10 out of 10. It was even better than I expected. The terrain was nothing but unbelievably beautiful. It was relaxing, but also very stimulating. There was options and a lot of choice in what you could do. The glacier was phenomenal. We saw so much wildlife. While it was cold, we were able to make it work, and the food was also really, really good. So if you're thinking of going to Iceland at any point, I highly recommend it. And I left the trip thinking we had such an amazing time, and I had two thoughts. One thought was that it would have been great to have at least another day or two, but it's better than not going at all. So I would say at least a good 4 days at Iceland is necessary. I mean, the island itself is pretty big, so it probably would take about 6 hours to drive to the other side of it. But definitely spend a good amount of time there because you're going to want to see everything that you can while you're there. And I imagine that you'll be doing a lot of driving, and you want to make sure you get everything in. And also with the Northern Lights, you really have to have some flexibility because not every night is a night where you can see them. So I would recommend at least doing a good 4 to 5 days. I think honestly, like 5 is probably a good idea. And then also, I am absolutely going to go back when it's the summertime because we didn't see as much green as some of the pictures I've seen, but it was amazing in a totally different way. So I definitely want to go back in the summer when we can see more rainbows and greenery and all that kind of stuff. So I will absolutely be back. It was incredible. The Icelandic people seemed to be very nice. There was a lot of English being spoken, and I would say for Americans traveling there or people from the UK, it's very accessible. It is not too exotic where you feel like you need a translator or anything like that. There's plenty of signs that have languages in a like all the major European languages, but also English. It's expensive to eat there, but it's so good. I was really pleasantly surprised by the food, and I just was blown away, and the rest of my friends were as well. So, highly, highly, highly recommend Iceland. It was an incredible trip that was a once in a lifetime type of trip, and I know that I'll be back there someday. So, it's not a goodbye, but it's a see you later. So, that is my Iceland recap. Next week, I will be doing a London recap as well because I had spent about the same amount of time in London too. But I'll give you all my recommendations there. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.